This podcast is brought to you by HEC Paris.
Monsieur le Président, Messieurs les directeurs, chers collègues, chers élèves, Mesdames et Messieurs. It's for us a very great honor and a very great pleasure to welcome Professor Zaleznik to HEC. Thank you very much, dear Professor Zaleznik, for being here this afternoon. I was just saying it's a great honor because it's clear that you're one of the greatest thinkers in the domain of the social psychology of organizations. Your work is in fact recognized by all the specialists worldwide. We are very proud to welcome this afternoon a professor from Harvard Business School, which is, as you know, a reference for all of us.
What I took from the French study was a deepened appreciation of the subtleties of power. It clarified for me the differences between authority and power, a subject I shall return to later in my comments. In preparing this paper on the problem of empowerment, I found the urge to reflect on the past irresistible. I cannot say that the dimension of power in leadership and organizations was always in the forefront of my consciousness. Indeed, power was a dimension I seemed to avoid studiously in my formative years as a researcher and teacher. An aspect of this avoidance can be attributed to the atmosphere at the Harvard Business School in the years following World War II. The preoccupation at the time was the problem of cooperation. The main intellectual influences derived from the work of the Human Relations School at the Harvard Business School, including the famous Hawthorne studies at the Western Electric Company, and the work of Chester Barnard, who authored the renowned book, The Functions of the Executive. The executive's job, or we thought at the time, was coordination of the efforts of others in a management of a cooperative system. The critical management skill was communication, which was the requisite condition for spontaneous cooperation. In other words, cooperation was not to be coerced, nor was it a function of the power a manager had to get people to act in ways that they might not choose to act if they were effectively autonomous. If this view of the intellectual atmosphere 50 years ago appears naive, let me confess that indeed I was relatively innocent in my outlook. After all, I was very young. As a young instructor and doctoral candidate at the Harvard Business School in the late 1940s, I wrote a dissertation on the role of the foreman in a factory. The study was based in part on intensive observation of a newly appointed foreman assigned to supervise an automatic assembly line. This line was newly engineered in a large factory recently acquired by the company that employed the foreman. Before acquiring this new plant, the product had been assembled on a chassis mounted on a dolly whose movement was entirely controlled by the worker. In the new factory, the chassis moved along continuously on a slowly moving belt as each worker completed her assigned steps in the product assembly. As you might easily imagine, the transition in work methods placed considerable pressure on the foreman. He became a prototype of the man-in-the-middle syndrome. His boss wanted production quotas met, Quality control supervisors wanted strict adherence to quality specifications. The industrial engineering department, responsible for the design of the line that included work setups and time and motion studies to assure the proper balance of the line, wanted uninterrupted production and especially no responsibility for bottlenecks on the assembly line. Finally, the assembly workers themselves wanted a stress-free work environment and the freedom to socialize with their neighbors on the line. The dissertation I wrote was successful. Besides earning my doctor's degree, the study resulted in my first published book that the dean referred to earlier, Foreman Training in a Growing Enterprise. I never forgot this study. Over the years, I found ample cause to re-examine my conclusions from this study until the issues surrounding the problem of power assumed center stage in my reflections. In earlier times, I would think about the study with the focus on role ambiguity and role conflict. Hence, the formulation of the frontline supervisor as the man in the middle of forces over which he seemed to have little or no control. Today, students of organizations and leadership think a great deal about the problem of empowerment, especially in the case of lower-level supervisors in modern organizations. They wonder about how to flatten the pyramid of authority, to decrease the social distance between the highest and lowest levels of the hierarchy. The flattened organization structure with increased autonomy at lower levels presumably should shift authority from the higher to the lower levels of the organization. In the case of my foreman in 1949, the increase in formal authority would presumably, I say presumably, have enabled him to exert more control over the assembly line to the benefit of production, quality, and the morale of the workers. Before leaping to this conclusion about the virtues of empowerment, we need to step back a pace or two to reflect more carefully on what is at stake in gaining and using power. Permit me to shift my focus from the lowest level of supervision to the highest, in this case, the position of the chief executive officer of an organization. Over the years, I have had the privilege of serving on many boards of directors of business corporations, both publicly and privately owned. I had the opportunity to observe firsthand how various CEOs, chief executive officers, use their authority to secure a power base and to utilize it in the service of their professional goals and personal needs. It may come as a surprise that there is a certain similarity in the problem of empowerment at the very top and the bottom of the hierarchy. The board of directors of a fairly large corporation had to select a new chief executive officer. The incumbent, while remaining on the board, stepped down on the occasion of his retirement. There was considerable urgency in naming his successor, since a corporate raider had instituted a proxy fight to gain control of this corporation. A candidate surfaced from a successful company in which this individual had served as chief operating officer. The challenge for him was to assume the #1 position. The board named him CEO, and he immediately devoted himself to winning the proxy battle. He worked hard, meeting with large shareholders, to make the case for supporting the existing board and management. He was successful in this fight and now had to turn his attention to figuring out what to do in his role as chief executive officer. I received a telephone call from this CEO shortly after the proxy battle. He wanted my opinion on undertaking a strategic study of the corporation. He said he wanted to hire a large and prominent consulting firm to conduct a study of strategic alternatives and to make a recommendation. My advice to him was not to do it. Don't follow this path, I said to him. I explained that he was new to the job and had just come off a successful proxy fight. He was unfamiliar with the industry, with his key executives, and with the strengths and weaknesses of the organization and of the business. If his first move, in my opinion, was to bring in a consulting firm with the visibility and profile of the firm he wanted to hire, he would lose a direct relationship with his subordinates and lower staff levels. All of this was, in my opinion, to him during this conversation. I said he would soon find, if he hired this consulting firm, that the executives and staff were referring to the consulting firm in their conversations, and that he would lose the knowledge to be gained from direct association with people who are going to report to him and others at lower levels in the organization. Furthermore, I suggested he would be unable or would have difficulty forming convictions about the company's problems and competitive situation and major strengths and weaknesses. His convictions, whatever they became, I said, would be a derivative of what the consultants told him and wanted him to believe. As I soon discovered, the CEO's solicitation of my advice was purely pro forma. He had already made up his mind concerning how he would approach his job, and what he was really after was my support among the board members for engagement of the consulting firm, which of course placed me in a very interesting position. After he made the decision to engage the consulting firm, the CEO asked me to review and comment on the consultant's proposal. I agreed to do this, and I was struck as I reviewed the proposal with one conclusion. The proposal that this consulting, a very distinguished and high-priced consulting firm, the proposal they made could apply to any business and lacked the clinician's art of a plan for diagnosis. When I reported my view to the CEO, he asked me to frame a set of questions to guide the investigations, for which my fee was negligible. I complied, and the CEO submitted my list of questions to the consultants. I received a communication from the CEO that the consultants had adopted my questions, as I recall there were 10 of them, with no amendment or comment, and incorporated my document as the main part of their consulting plan. My prediction of the effects of the CEO's course of action proved correct. He distanced himself from his people and effectively transferred his authority and ultimately power to the consultants. He became an unknown to his organization, as well as his board, as the consultants occupied center stage. To make matters worse, he lacked an independent base for judging the recommendations that came before him. He merely accepted the consultant's recommendation and asked the board for its support. As with many boards I have known, this board fell victim to inertia. It passively accepted the CEO's desire to implement the consultant's recommendation without engaging him in a lively discussion about the probable outcome and consequences of various recommendations the consultant had offered. In fairness to the board, I should note the difficulty it faced in engaging the CEO in a vigorous discussion of his felt need to engage a consultant. If the board members were to scrutinize the CEO or to criticize the CEO openly with the logic of my advice not to engage a consultant at this early stage of his tenure, it could have been taken as a measure of questionable, if not lack of confidence in him. the CEO could have perceived any discussion short of blanket acceptance of his initiative as doubting, questioning his competence. And boards are not likely to do that, particularly at the initial stages of the relationship. Board members are not inclined to risk what could appear as a usurpation of a CEO's prerogative. On the other hand, a substantively exciting discussion at this early stage of a CEO's tenure could have set the stage for a stimulating and productive intellectual relationship. The board members as a group preferred to avoid risk and simply assumed a passive position. The results of this consultation proved to be disastrous. After a time, the CEO was fired and the company was forced into bankruptcy because it could not overcome certain basic trends, forces that were affecting its industry. In the case of the foreman and the CEO, and I bring those two together, the problem at hand was the failure in infusing the role, the authority base, with power. Every role in the organization has some degree of authority vested in it. And this authority gives the incumbent the right to initiate action and thinking on the part of subordinates. In most cases, subordinates accept this right as legitimate and will usually attempt to perform within the acceptable range of expectations. But in this formula, nothing worthwhile will happen until the initiation carries with it a sense of personal power. And I emphasize personal power. The successful holder of the role, whether foreman or chief executive, provides a vector of action with both magnitude and direction. To create a vector requires a transformation in the internal psychological structure of the incumbent, following the pathway in human development from passivity to activity. If this formulation of what is necessary in transforming inert authority into active power is correct, then I face, along with you, a dilemma. What does empowerment mean? The dictionary definition of empower is, quote, to give power to someone, to give power to someone. An institution may grant authority to an individual, but it is up to the person to empower oneself. To empower oneself is a monumental achievement of the ego and requires, on our part, careful analysis and interpretation. This interpretation of empowerment led me to seek psychoanalytic training and qualification in the practice of psychoanalysis. But I should emphasize that I had laid the groundwork for this training in my experience as a student, researcher, and teacher at the Harvard Business School. The Harvard Business School was, and I hope still, is hospitable to the clinical tradition. With its emphasis on the case method, students are encouraged to experience the transformations involved in the move from a passive to an active state of mind. This experience with empowerment rests on the strength of one's intellect, the capacity for conviction, and the willingness to risk self-esteem in convincing others of the validity of one's conclusions. This combination of attributes is not a bad description of the qualities that describe an effective supervisor and CEO. Despite its clinical orientation, I am certain that most of my colleagues at Harvard were puzzled at my decision to train in psychoanalysis. But in my view, the need I addressed in undertaking psychoanalytic training followed in a direct line from all my experience, writing case studies, conducting research, teaching, and also consulting. The question I sought to answer was what prevents people from empowering themselves? The answer lay in the nature, I thought, of unconscious mental life and its relation to consciousness and the ego. In 1900, Sigmund Freud began an analysis of a young woman, age 18, who was suffering from many symptoms associated at the time with a pathology called hysteria. The symptoms were debilitating and caused severe restrictions in her life, as well as anxiety on the part of her parents. The patient, who became known in the psychoanalytic literature as Dora, came to Freud at the insistence of her father. She presented herself to Freud as a victim of attempted seductions. She was 18 years old, on the part of a married man whose wife, as it turned out, was in a sexual liaison with Dora's father, to make the picture very, very complicated. She traveled with her father to visit the Kays, that was the family name in disguise that Freud used, to visit the Kays, at which time it appeared as though the father pursued his relationship with Frau K. In effect, Dora seemed implicated in the affair, even to the point of giving in to Herr K's seduction or attempted seduction, which would appear both as revenge against the father and the price Dora would be forced to pay in her apparent complicity in the father's affair. The analysis lasted 3 months and terminated in Dora's abrupt decision to leave the treatment. Freud characterized the treatment as a failure. Although in the brief time Dora was with Freud, he managed to elicit many important features of what was keeping her illness alive and the resistance she unconsciously used to prevent Freud from succeeding in restoring her health. 2 aspects of the case are worth noting here. First, as many times as I have studied the case, it has never failed to stimulate my thinking about passivity and the condition of self-inflicted powerlessness. Self-inflicted powerlessness. Second, the case of Dora became a cause célèbre of the feminist movement. Freud and psychoanalysis were reviled on the grounds that Freud was a typical male chauvinist who had neither correct understanding of feminine psychology nor common decency to enable him to be sympathetic to an immature young woman who was being victimized by men. Her father, Herr K., the man who tried to seduce her, and now Freud. While I grant a number of criticisms of Freud and his treatment methods, I still remain fascinated by the case and the enduring truth Freud uncovered about this failure in empowerment. Being somewhat of a risk taker and so keen on the insights this case could provide, I decided to assign the Dora case to my MBA class at the Harvard Business School. The feminist movement was near its peak in arousing consciousness of the plight of the so-called second sex. And as you can imagine, I became the target of virulent criticism, which I did not particularly enjoy. The women in my class attacked me as another insensitive male, as an obtuse shrink, who, along with Freud, viewed women in stereotypic images. In the face of this onslaught, I persisted in asking for opinions on whether Dora had implicated herself in her father's affair, whether she had something to learn from her seeming passivity and her choice, if I can put it that way, of debilitating illness over life itself. She had a simple thing to do for herself, which would have said to her father, "Daddy, you go. I'm not going. I'm not involved." And with that act, she would have declared her independence. I wish I had assurance that I did meet with some success in intriguing my students in the complexity of unconscious motives to avoid responsibility. for persisting in passive suffering over active living. But for all of Freud's aggressiveness in interpreting Dora's erotic longing in the face of her moral standards, the case still challenges us to understand the blocks to what prevents self-empowerment. Did Dora have choices along with our foreman and the CEO? Were these choices overlooked out of blindness or risk aversion? The prospect of self-empowerment was brought home to me in my psychoanalytic treatment of a young and gifted man who had remarkable tendencies towards self-destructive behavior. He would experience episodically a buildup of rage and seek relief by excessive drinking and self-punitive acts. He would hold a lighted candle and burn himself, as though the experience of the pain would overcome the guilt he felt over his enormous rage. He was in treatment with me for a little over 3 years. The treatment involved 5 times a week, 50 minutes an hour. It became clear early in the treatment that he had a deep and unfulfilled longing for his father's love and approval. Instead of fulfilling his wishes in a sublimated relationship with his father, he experienced cruel rejection that rendered him helpless and provoked the rage followed by masochistic acts. The main problem in this relationship of father and son was that the father was incapable of expressing approval of his son, let alone love. I surmise that the father could not give to his son what he had not received in his own experience with his own father. The basis of this surmise was the father's open, flagrant envy of his son being in psychoanalysis. I should add a note to this interpretation how common the problem of father and son exists in family enterprises. The inability to give because one has not received perpetuates unrequited love or unrequited longing from one generation to the next. My interpretive work during this analysis centered on helping the patient become aware of what he wanted, but to come to recognize that it was not within his power to change his father. My effort was to show the patient what he wanted, rather than to give him what he wanted, as deeply as he wished to transfer, indeed did transfer, his wishes and dependency onto me. The patient arrived for his appointed hour on a Monday morning, settled himself on the couch, and announced that he had reached a decision. He had decided, he told me, to end the analysis, leave his job, and enter graduate school to prepare for a new career. Now, some analysts might have decided on hearing this from the patient to suggest that the patient continue an analysis a while longer to work on understanding the basis of his decision. The aim in this response would be to engage the patient in uncovering neurotic determinants in his apparently abrupt decision. I took another path and simply asked the patient to tell me how he had arrived at his decision. He replied with some humor that making the decision was easy. He suddenly became aware of the fact that when he read the literature in his current field, he would become sleepy. When he read in the field he proposed to enter, he experienced himself as alert, interested, and felt renewed energy. I thought his awareness, stated so simply, rang true and deserved to be respected. We set a final date, meeting date, and the patient left the analysis. A few years later, I received a request from the agency that was responsible for qualifying this candidate for his profession, asking me to write an evaluation of the candidate's psychological readiness for his profession based on my experience with him in analysis. This request came to me at the initiation of my former patient. He suggested to the agency they write to me and ask for my evaluation. What happened was that the patient had to take psychological tests as a condition for qualification in his new profession. The psychology had administered the tests and reported the presence of fantasy, probably through Rorschach tests, reported the presence of fantasies that could be interpreted in a negative way. Upon learning of this evaluation, the candidate suggested the authorities seek my opinion. I responded to the specifics of the psychologist's test results and learned from a letter of appreciation that the candidate passed the qualifying hurdle. He later informed me of his successful marriage and rapid advancement in his profession. Did the psychoanalytic treatment empower him? Did the underlying strength of what we call a positive transference to me finally enable him to get what he needed from a father figure? Or did he resolve his unconscious longings and guilt to make it possible for him to move forward in life? I shall leave these questions with you. You make the decision, and ask you to think about and reflect on possible answers. I'm afraid I might have left you with an oversimplified, if not false, impression. One might conclude from my comments thus far that becoming empowered through the transformation from a passive to an active frame of mind is all that it takes to become effective. And this transformation is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for effectiveness. I stated earlier that the effective use of power creates a vector, a force with both magnitude and direction. The direction of a vector is an outgrowth of talent. Magnitude without direction is wasted energy. I know of no psychological procedure, including psychoanalysis, from which talent can suddenly appear as part of an individual's mental capacity. If this were so, I assure you I would have become a great novelist instead of a laboring professor and psychoanalyst. Psychoanalysis can undo the conflicts that hinder the use of talent, but if a particular capacity does not exist, it cannot be instilled. In the business world, talent appears as a specific acuity or capacity. For some, the language of business is defined for them in numbers. Individuals who are gifted with a quantitative sense tend to see the world through the abstraction of reports and the analytical tools enabling these reports to take on meaning. For others, their gifts may well reside in the capacity to envision how work can be performed with greater efficiency, increasing productivity with the least expenditure of energy. For still other individuals, they resonate with the anticipation of how people will behave as consumers. In its most active form, this marketing acuity links people's needs with products or services. Another way of describing talent in business is to borrow from the humanities and consider the concept of imagination. Imagination is the distinctive way an individual perceives the world around him or herself. It is as though the inner world becomes selectively charged with perceptions of reality and in turn experiences highly invested with meanings and fantasies. Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of scientific management, perceived in the organization of factory work in his time a particular quality of idiosyncratic and random expenditure of energy. Taylor had a highly charged acuity, a talent, if you prefer, for observation. This talent was energized by an inner need for establishing order to overcome chaos. Taylor projected this inner need in combination with his capacity for observation, experimentation, and hard work, ultimately to revolutionize modern factory work. Under Taylor's scientific management, empiricism coupled with control came to dominate factory organization. A lesson to be learned from scientific management is how structural changes alter the balance of power in organizations. Where formerly frontline supervisors and skilled workers had considerable power, Taylor's system shifted the power structure to staff groups in industrial engineering. In lieu of power and autonomy, Taylor's scientific management promised higher income and the end of the tyranny of authoritarian management. In an impersonal system such as he had provided, harmony is to be found in a form of perfect justice. Everyone, or nearly everyone, is equally deprived. For Kurt Lewin, the father of the group dynamics school, the solution to the problems of industrial society laid in democratizing authority relations and encouraging the participation in decision-making at lower levels of the organization. While taking different approaches, in Mayo's case therapeutic, in Lewin's case democratization, both social scientists and their followers aimed at overcoming anomie, which seemed to be the noxious consequence of powerlessness, isolated, and uninvolved work. For those enamored with the new technologies, the problem of empowerment appears solved in the equalizing effects of information. Since information will be available to all through the computer, no one should be disadvantaged by the lack of information. What remains unanswered in the optimism engendered in the hope that information is power is the unequal ability individuals have in deriving meaning from information. The so-called knowledge worker who sits in front of a console reading data on the functioning of an automated open hearth or electric furnace making steel, or a rolling mill converting billets to sheet steel, has no more control than his forebears who labored directly, forcing the flow of work. In somebody's head will reside the chemistry of making steel, and for this person, indeed, knowledge is power. Finally, all the anguish and concern about power in organizations in the workplace may all be irrelevant to how most individuals lead their lives. Utopia may indeed lie in the capacity to bifurcate. Working to earn money will be the means to an end and not a source of identity, according to this point of view. The end will be pleasure-seeking through the arts of consumerism. A higher standard of living and longevity through improved health may render the problem of empowerment in organizations obsolete and in the ash heap of history. Earlier in my talk, I alluded to the distinction between authority and power. Authority is the right vested in a position to initiate thinking and action on the part of others. The crucial issues here are twofold: the legitimacy inherent in authority and the ego capacity to internalize the authority and to transform its legitimacy into a sense of personal power. As I suggested earlier, the strength of the ego rests in large measure upon the cultivation of talents or the imaginations that reflect the heightened sensitivities and perceptual links to reality. Ego capacities may indeed be inhibited or otherwise thwarted as a result of neurotic disturbance. But fortunately, life does not present us with an all-or-nothing dilemma. Either we are totally free of neurotic conflicts or destined to be paralyzed by impaired ego functions. Individuals learn from experience. They gain insights from experimentation, resulting in lasting enhancements to the ego. If my view is correct, that empowerment is not externally given, but internally achieved, we should have renewed confidence in human capacities and the gifts education provides in fostering ego development. Thank you very much.
Please visit us at www.hec.edu.